After my grandmother died in January of 2012, my mother found a notebook tucked into a corner of her attic. The front cover named Emma Stadtmiller as its owner, and though the surname was familiar as belonging to our relatives, no one had heard of Emma. Who was this person, and what did this writing mean? The pursuit of these answers is as much my story as hers, as I have found myself, throughout this process of investigation, wanting to know as much about the context of the writing, the people, places, and histories as I do about the writing itself. Emma Stadtmiller was a person. Who was she? When did she live? What did she do? What was life like for her? And how am I connected to all of this? This history entails understanding the history of the time, the people who populated the area in which Emma lived, and how writing fits into a larger national context. Emma lived in the town of St. Leon, Indiana in the late 1800s, the same town in which I have lived my entire life, and indeed where my father's family has lived for almost 200 years. Emma is related to me on my mother's side, and though we did not know it until I began this research, apparently the Stadtmillers lived in St. Leon for about 30 years prior to moving 20 miles west, which is the location we have always associated with that part of the family. Part of Emma's notebook is written in English, and the other part is in German. From other studies I've done and from stories passed down in my family, I know that the maintenance of German language practices within rural Indiana communities was a common occurrence up until around the time of World War I. Thus, finding German writing in her notebook was not terribly surprising. In the book Peopling Indiana, The Ethnic Experience, Giles Hoyt notes that immigrants from German-speaking countries comprise the largest group ethnicity that immigrated to Indiana, and that calling them German immigrants is actually a misnomer, since prior to 1871, many German-speaking states were comprised of independent kingdoms. Germans were the first non-English-speaking immigrants in America, and when they came here, geographic groups of the same faith tended to settle in common areas. This is consistent with the history of my family, all of whom are German Catholics and who settled around the Church of St. Joseph in southeastern Indiana. Studying the history of German women in the area was also helpful to my understanding, as the value placed on family, thrifty economic practices, the passing of land from one generation to the next, and the amount of manual work expected of German women are practices reflected in Emma's notebook, as well as in my own experiences within the same community. The inclusion of both English and German language in Emma's notebook was intriguing to me for a variety of reasons. First, I thought of Benedict Anderson's discussion of the importance of a shared language in creating a nation. Thus, Emma's notebook can be seen as a complicated site of conflicting nationalisms coming together through language within one artifact. How did German immigrants, especially in rural communities like this one, conceive of their national identities? Did they think of themselves as Americans, or as Germans, or some hybrid identity that included both? Though as yet I have not been able to translate or understand the parts of the text that are written in German, they are clearly composed as letters, though whether they are actual drafts which were copied and sent or just practice examples is somewhat unclear. Because of my family history, I'm curious about the language practices of German immigrants, especially in rural communities where they maintained the speaking and writing of German, often for many generations. Though Emma was born in St. Leon, her parents were born and married in Germany. Thus her practice of German alongside English in her notebook is not surprising for this time period. Alongside the notebook, we found 2 German almanacs, further evidence that Emma and her family probably maintained German language practices in their household. From the beginning of this project, I was aware of the intersection of my personal memories based upon the stories I had heard from my family members. These memories provided a site of connection between the history I was reading about and my own lived experiences within the same community and family. Though I did not live through this time period, nor know the writer of this notebook, my memories of passed down stories from both of my grandmothers give me an extant feel for the time and place in which Emma was writing, a sense of the community boundaries and families of the times. I note the overlap of her memory and my own when reading her writing and when conducting the research to find out more about who she was, where she lived, and whatever else I can piece together about her lived existence. Emma was the daughter of Adam John and Mary Eva Stadtmiller. They were both born in Bavaria and married there in 1863. When Emma was born on the 25th of September, 1875, she had 2 older brothers and 3 older sisters. Later, 2 girls and 2 more boys would be born into the family. After a long and arduous journey by ship, covered wagon, and oxen cart, Adam and Eva Stadtmiller finally arrived in St. Leon, where they already had relatives. Emma's father worked at the local mill, and they bought a house in town for $300. In 1873, they bought 40 acres, eventually expanding their farm to 60 acres. They remained in town until their house was completed in 1885 and moved to the property when Emma was 10 years old. This is a current picture of the house where Emma was living when she wrote the notebook, and it is also the house where she died a year later. Emma attended the school in St. Leon, and in 1885 there were about 120 students, some of whom had to sit on the floor for lack of room. This building was still standing when I was younger, and I remember that it was fairly run down. It has since been demolished and a new home is built on the site. In this image, Emma's gravesite can be seen in the foreground to the left of the building, though I am uncertain of the date that this picture was taken or whether Emma was still alive or already buried at that time. On October 1st, 1890, Emma's older sister Mary Charlotte married Philip Weistefeld a few days after Emma's 15th birthday. Less than 2 months after the wedding, on November 21st, 1890, Emma Cecelia Stadtmiller died at the age of 15 and was buried in St. Joseph's Cemetery. Though I searched and searched, no obituary was printed, and the county does not even have a record of her death. The only written account of her death is in the church document, though it does not mention anything about the cause of her death. It merely mentions the name of her father, the days she was born and died, and sacramentos bene provisa, meaning that her sacraments had been well provided. I learned a few things from this absence. In the late 19th century, the death of young people was not that notable. Unless someone happened to go to the county capital in Lawrenceburg in the time shortly after the event, her death may have been overlooked and unrecorded by the county. St. Leon is in the extreme north of Dearborn County, with Lawrenceburg in the extreme south. A large, steep hill separates them, and travel during the winter would have been treacherous. Furthermore, only those who held prominent positions in the community would have been likely to be mentioned in the newspapers, and though I looked and looked in 2 counties, there was no mention of her passing. She was not anyone's wife or mother, nor was she a community leader. Rather, she was just another young person, unknown outside of her immediate community, and thus no one thought to record her death outside of her parish. There are a few striking aspects of the notebook that immediately grab my attention. First of all, though at first glance this appears to be drafts of letters to various people, upon closer inspection it becomes clear that it is likely that this writing reflects various composition assignments that Emma completed either for school or on her own. Given the history of St. Leon, it is likely she was enrolled in school, and from research that I have conducted about the nature of composition instruction in the latter part of the 19th century, it seems clear that this writing reflects very typical assignment structures for that time. This genre of letter writing is very consistent with the letter drafts found in Emma's notebook. On one page she might address her aunt, but on the next she will return the letter as though written from her aunt. She likewise writes letters to order items for a shop, and inquires about a job as a dressmaker in another. Additionally, there is a letter to her parents, and some seem to be written to grandparents and other relatives, though those are mostly in German and have not yet been translated.
I was sorry when I saw in it that your dear mother is sick. We hope that she will be better in a few weeks. You asked for some information on the health of my parents also. I must say that they are well, and as much as I have heard, all of our relations too. Uncle John stays with us now. To help great desire and pleasure, I have awaited this getting too old and feeble to do the work himself. Eagerly take this opportunity to that you intend to visit us, wishes by which we are much pleased. And I wish you all that a good child can wish or think of. I will may the coming year be a happy one for you. From may our heavenly Father look down upon you with mildness and kindness, and keep far away whatever could trouble or grieve you. And grant you I have seen your advertisement in the Evening Star, though I am unable to show my gratitude by dressmaking. I will prove it is a sincere wish of mine to learn it, as we have a large congratulations and most girls. Your grateful and obedient daughter, take me. Emma Stadtmiller. It is a great desire of mine to be one of your number. Yours truly, Emma Stadtmiller.
Near the back is an extended section entitled Rules of Etiquette, which appear to be copied from another source. In this way, rules expected of a young woman of that era could be learned while also practicing writing, composition, and penmanship. These rules, though likely impossible to follow all of the time at all times, gives me a sense of the expectations of a young woman like Emma at this time, despite telling me nothing of her own thoughts, feelings, or actions in relation to these rules.
Rules for etiquette. The hands. The hands should always be clean, nails neatly cut, but never bitten nor ornamented with black stripes. The walk should not be too rapid, brushed, hurried, do not make motions dragging with your along hands, as if life were a burden. Never looks as improper as hurrying along as if someone were in pursuit. Do not shake and swing the clothing when walking. It is equally reprehensible in muddy weather to drag through the streets when seated, without keep raising, the feet perfectly quiet. To show the never cross them when there is no necessity for it. Do not place one foot upon the other objects. Never swing the feet when sitting. Never raise the foot to kick or knock anything out of the way, to force doors open, or the like.
Researching Emma Cecelia Stadtmiller has left me with more questions than answers, yet I still feel compelled to seek connections and narratives that make sense of the interconnected web of genealogy, history, and memory. In trying to recover any traces of Emma that I possibly could, I was sent old photographs of the Stadtmiller family, and though I have nothing conclusive, there is a slight possibility that I may have recovered an image of her when she was a child. This is an image of Emma's mother, Mary Eva Stadtmiller, from around the turn of the century. One of the pictures that I have is an older photograph of an unidentified Stadtmiller woman standing in front of a house with two children in the yard near her. The Stadtmillers would have lived in the town of St. Leon when Emma was young, and this house appears to be in a town of sorts as evidenced by the objects seen in the background. Additionally, I think I may have found the current rendition of this house in the town of St. Leon as well. It's possible that in this older picture, the children in front of the house may be Emma and her slightly older brother, John Joseph. It should also be noted that very young boys and girls were not dressed particularly different at this time, and a zoom into the photo makes it appear that the older child is male and the younger child is female. If this is Mary Eva 20 years previous to the other picture, then based upon the spacing of the Stadtmiller children and when they lived in town, the child on the left would be Emma Cecelia at about 2 years of age. An additional note of interest is that as soon as I began researching Emma Cecelia, I was reminded of a story told to me by my grandmother during a recorded interview a few months before she died, where she recounted the story of her sister Cecilia, who died as a very young girl and was buried on her 7th birthday. In the words of my grandmother,
"They don't know what happened to her. Some of them said she had sinus with infection. That's all she complained about was a terrible headache. And she eventually died. Yeah, she was buried on her 7th birthday. And if you want to hear something funny, on her 7th birthday when she was buried, the weather was just atrocious. The roads and that was nothing but slop and mud, and you couldn't drive a car or nothing else. So poor old Cecilia, they had her in a horse and buggy to take her to bury her."
I wondered, was the name of Emma Cecelia carried on through the family, or was this just a fluke? Searching through the family tree, my suspicions were confirmed. Mary Charlotte, Emma Cecilia's older sister, had married Philip Weistefeld just 2 months before Emma died. In remembrance, Mary Charlotte named her first daughter, born on the 21st of July in 1892, 2 years after the death of her sister Emma Cecelia Weistefeld. Her second child, a boy, died in infancy, and then she herself died giving birth to her second daughter, Mary Anna, who was my great-grandmother. Mary Anna's father, Philip, gave her to her maternal grandparents, the aforementioned John Adam and Mary Eva Stadtmiller, who raised her through her whole life. Emma Cecelia II grew up and married Frank Henefeld and gave birth to a daughter named Marie, who was my great-aunt. However, she died when Marie was only 2 years old, and Frank Henefeld married Emma Cecilia's sister, Mary Anna, who had been raised by the Stadtmillers. Mariana, in turn, named her first daughter after her newly deceased sister, thus the Cecelia my grandmother told me about, who had died on her 7th birthday all those long years ago. It is interesting to note that the very last thing written in the notebook I have from the original Emma Cecelia is an entry on the back cover, where apparently someone in the family was keeping track of birth and death dates. It says simply, Westerveld, 6 October 1895, the day that my great-great-grandmother died and my great-grandmother was born. What do I take away from all of this? Because of my interest in women's composing practices from the 19th century, I am aware that these documents were not always valued or kept. Thus, to recover women's writing, we sometimes need to look in places that are not official archives or matters of public record. Thus, it does not surprise me that my grandmother's attic was just such a place. Despite its relative obscurity, Emma's notebook is of value to me, both from an historic perspective regarding my larger research interests, and also because these writings are traces of a real lived life, made more poignant through her relation to me and my family's history and stories. Though her life and death may not have been deemed notable enough for mention in the papers or even in the county death records, someone in the family thought her important enough to preserve and keep her writing, the careful hand of a young woman practicing the composing skills she thought she would need as an adult member of her community, a position she did not live long enough to achieve. I thought about these things as I visited the county offices, the historic societies and libraries, as my mother called various relatives and neighbors, trying to get information, pictures, or any other traces of Emma's life. Her living and dying overlapped greatly with my own lived memories and experiences, and this journey to recover her life and history took me barely outside my own front door, and yet simultaneously transported me more than 100 years back in time. As we drove around snapping pictures of houses, or explored the grounds of the church and cemetery, I was struck by how close and yet how distant I was from Emma. Here she was, her body under my feet, her notebook in my hands. I wondered how long it had been since someone visited her grave, or took the time to clean it, or cared enough to pick flowers to bring to her. Though ignored in records and largely unknown in family histories, I have a relationship with her now, a collaboration across time to recover and value the written works of women who might otherwise be forgotten.